Welcome to How It's Restored. I'm David Cooper. In this moment, we'd like to talk a little bit about the assembly of the car and how we brought it to completion. So we've talked about the restoration of many different parts of this car. We talked about how we started with the history, figured out determined how we were going to pick the best time to restore this car, what it meant to restore it to the time that Dorothy Patton owned it and raced it with her husband Reiner Dorndorf, and sort of what the car was in 1939. How could we bring it back to that? And we talked a lot about all the exterior components that were on the car in the pictures from 1939. We talked about restoration of the body, the mechanicals, the engine, the electrical, the interior, the driver controls, the shifter, all sorts of special features. We talked about making the windshield work in its up and down motion. So we talked a lot about all these things, but what we didn't talk about yet is how we put all that together and made it into a working car. The first thing is that, the body had to come to be assembled. I mean, once the mechanicals are done and we've tested all the mechanicals and we've tested the engine and we've got the proper oil pressure and everything runs right and starts well and all the pieces work, we have to put the body together. And that meant taking these beautifully painted parts and assembling them with the welting that goes between the fender and the body and fitting everything properly and putting the final parts in. We had special welting made to match the leather of the seats, and I believe this matches the color of the seats very nicely and complements the car. We put that together between the fender and the body and tightened all the screws, put the body fenders on, they get bolted together. There's a nut and the washers and what's called fender washers, sort of extra large washers that hold these parts together. There was a lot of work in fitting the car together, but now let's say we've got it done and it looks beautiful and we're happy with the way it fits. Then we've got to fit the hood, and the hood was an interesting problem because when we stripped the hood and repainted it, we discovered that the hood didn't fit the car very well. It had been not fitted as well as it could have been, and some of the reasons it didn't fit well were related to the filler that was on it. So when we stripped all the filler off, the hood shape changed somewhat, and we had to very delicately bend the hood to fit to shape, and that was a really touch and go little thing while the hood's painted, because otherwise we would have had to redo it and repaint it, which we didn't want to do. And fortunately we didn't have to. The hood fit the car once we did that, but it was three of us working on the hood very delicately, pulling it in with a special tool we made to pull the sides into the shape we wanted and make sure that the arc of the hood on the top fit the car and sealed against the cowl. So there was a lot of little detail stuff like that we did on the car. Then once it was done, that's when the upholsterer gets to work. He's really one of the last people to work on the car. And he worked on the seats and fitted them. He'd already made the seats, but they had to be final fitted to the car. He had to make the carpet, the tunnels, and all the pieces that cover the seat, the transmission, and where the footwells are, and the door panels and all this stuff. Meanwhile, we were working on the paint. And it's sort of a funny thing, but once the lacquer paint is dry, we were able to polish the paint to a nice finish, and that's a show finish. And that's done with a very special polish, and it's done with buffing compounds and very special buffing wheels that were made of lamb's wool. But the process of polishing them has to be very careful because lacquer paint is both sensitive to certain kinds of chemicals, so you have to use the right kind of polishes. And in addition to that, you can't build up any heat because it could affect the finish of the paint. So you have to do it very carefully. The car looks amazing, and it will stay that way, but lacquer paint doesn't stay in one condition. So, I mean, if I had this car out in the sun for a year, it would start to fade a little bit and the finish wouldn't stay as shiny. I mean, now this car has been done now several years, and it still looks pretty amazing because it really hasn't been exposed to a lot of weather. Really the last thing after the seats are in and the car's polished and everything's done and it's nearly ready to go back to the client The last part is really test driving the car, making sure everything functions properly, making sure it continues to function properly. And that's something we spent some time driving around, testing everything, finding, oh, this switch isn't quite as good as we want it to be or reliable, we had to fix this, or this didn't work the way we thought it was, this wire didn't come into the right place, or it got too hard to pull the starter, so we have to fix the spring on the starter to make sure it's not so hard to pull. You know, if they really yank it to get it to work. Little things like that you couldn't tell until you started driving. And once that's all done, I wrote up a great starting procedure sheet so that the owner would know what to do when he wanted to try the car and remember what he's supposed to connect, and et cetera. We put a kill switch on the batteries so it wouldn't drain when the car was just sitting. And you know, basically then it's ready to go. We actually drove the car enough to do an initial oil change. So we took out the, what they call running in oil. It's the initial oil you put on a fresh engine. And we put in the factory oil that we recommended, which is a high zinc content oil for an older engine. And that's what's in the car now. So, I mean, there's a handful of little things we did for the owner, and then we delivered it to him. What's nice about this car, when you finally get into it and drive it, is that it runs just the way it should. It performs the way it should, it handles the way it should, the steering is tight, the brakes work, the acceleration is good, the performance is good. It is exactly what it would have been when Dorothy was racing it. The only difference is we aren't running the Mamini carburetors, so it's a little less finicky to drive than it would have been otherwise. But aside from that, the experience should be very similar to what was raced in 1939, and it really does show you the state of the art, little sports racer car, under 2-liter class that was running at that time. Roughly the process of this whole restoration was about 2.5 to 2 years and 8 months or so of work. It got somewhat delayed in the middle because of the pandemic, but in general, that's the amount of time that the process took, and that's not atypical for this kind of restoration. There's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of research, chasing after parts that we needed in France and in other places, and fixing and building things and having the steering rebuilt, et cetera. It was a fairly complex restoration for what it was in the process that we did. One of the interesting things for me as a restorer when I work on this car is that we continually learn about these cars and their history and the restoration and details about the people and the provenance and all sorts of things. And that doesn't stop just because the car is finished. I mean, our interest is still strong in the car. We've done a lot of work on this car. And I just learned recently, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that the motor that we thought was not correct for this car is in fact the original engine that was in the car. And that made the car more valuable. It was a really important discovery. You know, in this business that we're in, it's so complex, and there's so many elements of things that have to be dealt with in the restoration, and I have so many different people who help us with the work that we do on so many levels. I mean, the people who work for me directly, but also all the subcontractors, all the researchers, all the contacts who have information, all the historians and sources and people who have helped us. And it takes a huge amount of knowledge and time, and so in addition to all that, it's necessary that we have to learn what was contemporary at the time in practice to build these cars, which is all obsolete technology today. Nobody uses this technology anymore, but we have to become masters of this old technology. It's part of the process of what we do in restoration. I'm fascinated by it. I love this part of it because, you know, I think it's just interesting to see how things were made, why they were made that way then, what other choices did they have, what could have been done, what was done, and how these extraordinary cars were built at the time. It's just amazing stuff. So we've covered the restoration of the car all the way through the preparation of delivery to the client, to the owner, and he was very happy to get the car and very pleased with the result, which is a good sign. But what I'd like to do here is talk next about the history of the owner and the provenance and some of the ways that we look at this car because of that.